continuing on with commercial leasing, and we're arriving at one of the most challenging parts. But this part's easy. Test your knowledge. 7. In the case of a strata situation, what is the percentage required for a party to control the strata corporation? 50, 60, 75, or 80%? 8. Can a landlord give an exclusive right to use common property? Yes or no? 9. Can a landlord give a covenant to repair the building if it does not control the strata corporation? Yes or no? 15. The BCREA, BCREA I call it, Standard Form Offer to Lease. The BCREA Offer to Lease is a generic document intended to be used in a wide variety of applications. It is intended to be used with a landlord's standard lease. Licensees must ensure that the offer to lease is compared with the landlord's standard lease for the property and any differences reconciled. For example, the offer to lease states that the measurements shall be determined using the BOMA standard, yet this may not always be the case. It is the licensee's responsibility to determine how the landlord or tenant wants the space measured and to make the appropriate changes to the offer to lease. Situations not included or covered in the offer to lease should be addressed by attaching schedules and or appendices to the offer to lease. Some of the situations requiring schedules are shown on the information page accompanying the standard form. The standard form is comprised of 2 sections. Part 1, Information Summary, a fill-in-the-blanks type form which describes the variables, basic business terms of the offer to lease, the offer. And Part 2, Terms, the static body of the contract, which refers to the information contained in Part 1. This format is similar to that found in many standard form leases and makes it relatively simple to complete the offer to lease. Both parts of the standard form offer to lease refer to and require detailed schedules to give substance to the offer to lease. A list of usual schedules is found in section 17, part 1 of the offer to lease. You may have to include additional schedules as necessary to fully complete an offer to lease to reflect the terms agreed upon by the landlord and the tenant. The BCREA standard form offer to lease is attached as Appendix B, page 74. So, comments regarding the offer to lease. Let's consider the provisions of the BCREA standard form offer to lease. So, we've got section 1, prepared by, reference section, not applicable, remarks, identifies the brokerage and the representative. And we have section 2, the parties. Reference section, remarks, identifies the parties to the lease. So 29, notice. Any notice shall be in writing, and prior to the commencement date, the addresses of the landlord and tenant for notices shall be the addresses set out in section 2 of this offer, and any such notice shall be deemed to be received by the party to whom it was addressed. If delivered by hand, then upon delivery, or on the 3rd business day after the date on which it was mailed by prepaid registered mail, except in the event of labor disruptions affecting postal service occurring prior to the deemed date of receipt thereof, or in which case notice shall only be delivered by hand. 2. The parties, i.e., landlord, tenant, or covenantor. 29. A. Ensure the parties are correctly identified. In the case of a proprietorship, the tenant is the individual proprietor, but may be identified as John Doe, DBA, John's General Store. B. Generally, the landlord will be the owner of the building, but it might be an existing tenant who is subleasing or signing an existing lease. In case of a sublease or an assignment, use an appropriate form, not this offer to lease. C. Ensure you get the correct legal names. Is it a proprietorship, a partnership, or a corporation? 2.10 to 2.12. Covenantor. 30. Okay, the covenantor is a party who will meet the tenant's obligations should the tenant fail to do so. So 30, covenantor. If this offer is accepted by the landlord, the covenantor specified in section 2.10 and in further consideration of the landlord accepting the offer shall be bound to preserve and perform the terms of this offer as accepted, as if the covenantor were the tenant, and the covenantor shall execute and deliver to the landlord as covenantor named therein the lease concurrently with the execution and delivery thereof by the tenant. The covenantor covenants with the landlord that the covenantor is jointly and severally bound among themselves and the tenant for the fulfillment of all obligations of the tenant under this offer and the lease. Section 3, property remarks. Ensure that you have the correct legal description. 18, description of premises. The premises shall consist of approximately the square footage set out in section 3.4 and as shown outline on the plan attached hereto as schedule 3.3, if so indicated. All measurements shall be determined using the current Building Owners and Managers Association's BOMA standard method of measurement, and basic and additional rent shall be adjusted accordingly. We have previously considered the BOMA standards. 3.1, legal descriptions, section 18. 3.3, the premises. 18, A, using a drawing or sketch in a schedule 3.3. Check B, check appropriate box. C, whenever possible, have the landlord provide a survey plan showing the rentable area of the building. D, using heavy black hatching to describe the premises. 3.4, area of premises. 18, A, insert the rentable or leasable area, i.e. the area on which rent will be calculated. B, note that section 18 calls for measurement in accordance with BOMA standard. If the lease uses different methodology, amend the offer to lease. 4, term. 19, usually stated in years. 19, term. The term of the lease shall be for the term set out in section 4.1, commencing on the commencement date set out in section 4.2 and expiring on the expiry date set out in section 4.3. 4.2, commencement date. Section 19, commencement date and possession date can be and often are different dates. This is especially so if there is a fixturing period. 4.3, expiry date. 19, the expiry date is the last day of the term. 5, possession. 20, the possession date is the date the tenant may occupy the premises. It may be the date the tenant's fixturing period commences. 20, date of possession, occupancy. The tenant shall have possession of and may occupy the premises on the possession date set out in section 5.1. Possession, section 20, 5.1. A, enter the date for possession. B, note the requirement in section 26 that the lease is to be executed by the tenant and any covenantor prior to the tenant taking possession. Note the deeming clause whereby the tenant is deemed to have executed the lease and bound by its terms if it takes possession without executing the lease. C, it is common for possession to occur before the commencement date. This is usually called usually for the fixturing period. 6. Rent. Complete the table. 21. Basic rent. The tenant shall pay to the landlord the basic rent specified in section 6, payable monthly in advance without deduction in equal monthly installments on the first day of each and every month throughout the term in the amount specified in section 6 commencing on the commencement date or in accordance with schedule 6.6 if attached. 22. Additional rent. The lease shall be absolutely net or gross to the landlord as specified in section 6.3, except for structural defects, as defined in the lease, the expense of which shall be borne by the landlord, and if net, in addition to basic rent plus GST, the tenant shall pay for all other charges and expenses provided for in the lease from the commencement date, including without limitation, the tenant's proportionate share being the ratio of the rentable area of the premises divided by the total rentable floor area of the building, of property taxes, business taxes, water sewer rates, building insurance, maintenance, management fees, heat, light, and power plus GST applicable to the foregoing. The additional rent. The additional rent shall be estimated and adjusted annually by the landlord and paid in advance with the basic rent on the first day of each month and every month throughout the term. The estimated additional rent in respect of the premises is set out in section 6.4 and shall commence on the date specified in section 6.5. 6.1 to 6.6 basic rent and additional rent. 21 and 22. A. Basic rent may also be called minimum rent. B. Compare the list of expenses and the formula for calculating proportionate share included in the section with those in the landlord's lease. C. If the rent is a hybrid, i.e. it isn't absolutely net or fully gross, use a schedule to define explicitly who is responsible for which expenses. Section 7. Permitted use. Reference section 23. Permitted use. So the tenant shall use the premises for the permitted use specified in section 7.1 only and for no other purposes without the prior written approval of the landlord as set out in the lease, such approval not to be unreasonably withheld. 7. Permitted use. 23. A. Ensure the zoning permits the tenant's intended use. B. Try to be specific without being too restrictive. And C. Watch out for exclusives that might have been granted to other tenants. 8. Landlord's improvements. 24. Landlord's improvements. The premises are to be provided by the landlord on an as-is, where-is basis, except for those improvements outlined in Schedule 8.1, which shall be provided at the landlord's expense. The landlord shall be responsible for all permits for the landlord's improvements. All other leasehold improvements shall be completed at the tenant's cost. 9. Tenant's improvements. 25. So 25 tenant's improvements. The tenant agrees to accept the premises on an as-is, where-is basis as viewed by the tenant on the viewing date specified in section 9.1, except for that work specifically set forth in Schedule 8.1 as the landlord's improvements. The tenant shall carry out all work necessary to complete the premises as set out in the attached Schedule 9.2. The tenant shall be required to prepare working drawings of the proposed tenant's improvements and obtain the written consent of the landlord before commencing the tenant's improvements, such consent not to be unreasonably withheld. All tenant's improvements shall be done at the tenant's sole cost and expense by qualified and licensed contractors and subcontractors who shall be subject to the reasonable approval of the landlord unless otherwise agreed between the parties in Schedule 9.2. All such tenants' improvements shall be performed in a first-class manner in accordance with the provisions of the lease. The tenant shall be responsible for all permits for the